does go into effect, or if the president extends tariff to products that aren't currently receiving a tariff, I think it'd be really huge problem for our industry and any other importer of products from China. The other thing that keeps me up awake is what happened to Badger Sportswear with the finding of prison forced workers camp in Western China making their garments. That's always huge, something we look very closely at with our factories. But fact of the matter is, there are prisoners making products around the world, and you have to really be vigilant to make sure that the factories making your products aren't using prison labor.
Andy, any thoughts that you want to add there?
I do agree with Larry. I mean, I think definitely the tariffs will have a big impact, whether it's direct on everything's going to get more expensive. So, that cost gets passed on to customers and so on, and that changes. And on top of that, it changes like where you want to source from.
Right.
And Larry mentioned prison labor, slave labor. That's always a challenge, especially like a lot. You see your tier one suppliers, but how far down the supply chain do you go, and can you go to see where the raw materials come from? Is there challenges there where we have a lot of visibility into our tier one suppliers and then tier two and components and stuff. And so you keep going up and up. And then depending on how you run your supply chain, it could be a challenge. And it's, again, you see the US brands, it's the same thing. Like how much did they really know when you use a place like this, and how good is your compliance program, I think. And then the other one is just unknown challenges. I mean, power banks, for example, like, I'm sure somebody was thinking about it, but you have this new item that comes on and it's selling and everybody wants to get it. And then you run into issues where there's a safety challenge. So managing getting new items, but at the same time, making sure you're doing your due diligence and not jumping quickly onto something. And luckily for us, we have a core group of items, so we're not going too much into that. But every time we do it, it's taking that time to review it and slowing it down from the compliance side versus saying, let's get this out there quickly and then running into issues later. And the other thing I would say is things like Prop 65 that have been around for a while, and this year came up, and there's a lot of questions. It's, are people looking at all the existing laws, or is there a focus on, what's new versus, well, I have stuff I need to be looking at from regulatory compliance because, yes, the law changed, but it didn't change that much. And I think we had a lot of questions of what's this new law. So again, if something like that happens on an existing law, is there going to be a lot of the same questions around, okay, well, I didn't know about this, so now what do I need to do?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd like to kind of circle back to the question about trade wars. If you think about price escalating, as you mentioned, Andy, what does that mean for your sourcing strategy? Does that mean that you're staying in China?
So I think the first thing is looking at the product base, because if there are products you can get outside of China, but there's things that China wants and it's harder to do outside of China. But I think everybody's looking outside of China as well. And once you get into outside of China, now you have suppliers in China that are at a certain level, that understand your requirements, understand compliance, understand the quality requirements. But if you do look outside of China, you need to transfer all of that and not just go somewhere else. And I think, what would worry me is if we didn't have that visibility, if we were just using a trader or something like that, because then they're picking a vendor. And I think the same thing happens even in China. If you need to the same price and you don't know where your product is being produced, you have a much higher chance that it's going to be something that's not legal. I know, the recent story with camps in China, that's growing. You have forced work, who was it a couple months ago or last year sometime, some of these products were being made in North Korea that they didn't know.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, how much control do you have, especially if you're pushing heavily on price? And with tariffs going up, do you start to get into more issues because now you need to hold your prices? And I think that impacts the whole supply chain. But at the same time, I think I think it just speeds up a lot of times looking elsewhere. I think there's been a movement. China doesn't want some of the items they manufacture, some of the items, because they are, let's say, not they're lower end manufacturing. So I think it speeds it up. But I think there's been a move out of China. But I think it depends on the product base. There's certain things that are don't have a good supply chain. And then the other part is going into components, right? So something that's very labor intensive is easier to move than something that isn't and requires a lot of components, because where do those come from? So if you have a lot of components coming from China, again, depending on how much labor is input in the other countries, maybe you can get around the tariffs, but then you run into issues. Now you got to get those components there, and then you got to make them there and stuff. And again, that whole, I think, certain suppliers in China that at least that we use, they've been kind of trained, if you will. You start that process again when you go to another country.
Well, and I think we also find that many Chinese suppliers have invested in Southeast Asian factories outside of China. And some of the factories are shifting some of their work that way. Mm-hmm. So much to the point you're making about products that require a lot of componentry in those companies where they've been able to make investments in, for example, Vietnam. They're able to do some transformation in China and then ship it to Vietnam.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, because there are definitely a lot of vendors that are in China that have expanded, but it's how much control do they have? Mm-hmm. And then you don't have, you might have management that's Chinese that knows how the factory worked, mm-hmm. But a lot of the workers are going to be local. So then mm-hmm. it's again making sure that the knowledge is being transferred, the training is being transferred. That you don't want to start getting a product from another country, even if it's an existing supplier, and have issues with it because the local labor force doesn't understand how to make it like the labor force you had. So I think it's, there's definitely a lot of suppliers that are out there that are in multiple countries, but working with them to see, well, what kind of expertise do you have, and how are you transferring that to your other factories?
Mm-hmm. Larry, anything you want to add there?
No, Andy's right on. It's incredibly challenging shifting your supply chain outside of an established country. China has, over the past 40 years, developed a very robust infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't just their highways and ports and transportation. It's an infrastructure of supporting factories with raw materials. So there's a huge infrastructure of fabric suppliers and zipper pull manufacturers and fixtures and suppliers of all sorts of little components that go into products, wheels for suitcases, cables for chargers. It's just incredible. And that depth of supply chain infrastructure just is not present in any other country in the world. So if you're moving out of China, as we've been doing and as Gemline's been doing, we find that we need to figure out how to replicate some of those pieces that are so seamless in China. So it makes it a tough one.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that too, it's, you run into lead time. So getting something, even though China's a big country, getting a component from one part to the next is easier than moving it to another country, going through different customs regulations. So I think we don't really think about where the component's coming from. So you see the final product, but where did all the pieces come from? And if they're not all coming from the country you're sourcing from, well, you're waiting, you have some additional wait time there.
Circling back to the question you alluded to, Andy, Prop 65, do you anticipate, are we likely to see additional changes outside of new additions to the list? We've got labels, we've got updates to the language required for labels. We've got reporting changes that have all been implemented since August. Do we anticipate, I know that there are some discussions related to further revising Prop 65. Are you anticipating, Larry, Andy, anticipating additional changes?
Well, I know does have an open comment period on the labels right now. They're trying to get some clarification for, I think, from what I read, more directed toward the retailers. But anytime they open anything related to Prop 65 up for public comment, anything could happen. So I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year they make recommendations for minor modifications to verbiage on labels, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I know the open comment period, I would also not be too surprised if they change how the labels are, but I think, from our end, it's like, part of it is this law's been around for a long time. And I think it was kind of in the background. You didn't really think about it until all of a sudden there's a lot of news out, hey, this is coming up. So even if there's a minor change, hopefully we're not running around trying to explain this to people that are asking, because you've gone through this and it's just, all right, now we need the new label. If it's a different label than what we're using, assuming that we're labeling products. If you're not labeling products, unless a chemical gets added that's in your product, you're going to be in the same kind of area. So I don't think it'll change much. And I think, again, with the education that went around to try to, suppliers, distributors, end buyers, everybody on the same page, hopefully that would kind of transfer, and any minor changes would be more like, okay, well, what are you doing with this minor change now that I have something and I've been working on something around Prop 65 that I maybe wasn't paying attention to before.
Any new products that pose a potential issue in your mind?
No, but
a new mission. Go ahead.
Yeah, from my end, no, but we kind of are specialized in certain areas. But I think it's, again, that unknown. If you look at recalls, like, most of them aren't because a product is not complying with the regulations, but simply it's
poses a hazard.
Poses a hazard and is hurting somebody. And I think that's always the challenge, that as we design products and we look at those designs, making sure that we're considering that part of it. Is it safe? Not, is it compliant to the regulation? It could be, but it might not be safe. So I think that's always the challenge is we have a design team we're designing, and I'm working with them closely on both the quality and compliance side. And it's making sure that we're not going to design something that's going to hurt somebody.
Larry, I noticed that there were a lot of socks on the expo floor this year, something I'd never seen. I think maybe one last year. Are you adding socks into your line?
Not that I know of. No, I did notice a lot of cool looking socks out there. I'm pretty boring on my socks, dark colors, no patterns, no fish. But I did see some pretty cool socks.
Yeah, well, who knows what the hazards are certainly there's some, if we think about it, it might be something along the lines of where these socks are actually produced.
Right.
I think until 2006, most of the a large portion of the socks were made in Honduras. Now, almost all of the sock industry, much like other industries, has substantial portion has moved to China. And of course, we do have some domestic production here. So lots of different ways you might find your socks.
Yeah. Dee, to get back to your early question on what is coming up, risks, Andy raised a good point is on risks. Does something hurt you? That's something our industry tends to confuse product safety with regulatory compliance, and they're not the same thing. Product safety is, does a product actually hurt you? Will it make you ill? Will it kill you? Will it injure you? Regulatory compliance is what we tend to call product safety, and that's just doesn't meet the regulatory requirements. It does not mean a product is safe. And as Andy said, most recalls, the products do meet the applicable regulatory requirements, but there was some other defect or issue that made it unsafe that injures people. And that's something our industry really needs to get straight. Just meeting the regulations does not mean a product is necessarily safe.
Well, and I think that's kind of a good segue into the next set of questions that we wanted to discuss. What is your company adding to your compliance program, or how are they enhancing it in 2019? Much to I think the point you're making, Larry, is what kind of risk assessment are you performing? Is it robust enough? Does it anticipate the sorts of issues that the potential issues a product might have? Is that?
I'll speak first. This is a tough one because, frankly, I don't think anyone in our industry has true engineers on their staff engineering products. We review products. We'll design cut and sew products, but there's relatively minor risks involved with those. But products that have risks, like pinch points or fire hazards or things like that, I'm not competent to evaluate the engineering of a product. So we all rely on labs to advise us and take a common sense approach and look at it. And, if a common user, normal user is going to use this, can you trap a finger in there? Or somebody misuse it in a manner that makes it unsafe? And you have to make some value judgments. But you need to do that for every product you launch.
Yep. Yeah, especially as you get into those higher risks, right? So if we have a backpack that's not for kids, there's different designs. It looks different, but the risk stays pretty much the same. But you get into electronics where you're dealing with lithium batteries. Where are you getting them from? We actually go out and get some outside consulting to review the diagrams and stuff. But again, then is it manufactured the same way? There's tools that you can use when it comes to UL certification, but that costs money. So is that something that you want to do? And then adding to the compliance program, I think this goes back to the question of outsourcing as well. Like if we're changing countries, I think the big thing is looking at what are the unique challenges of those countries. I think most of us are in China and everybody's seen an audit report, and there's certain things that you always see. And it's, you kind of understand what are the really bad things that are red flags that you're like, no, we can't use a factory or we can't use them till they make corrections versus, okay, this is something that's, yes, it's on the books as legal, but maybe it's not that well enforced. So getting into other countries and understanding overtime's a good one. A lot of factory workers are at the factory. They want overtime. They want more pay in China. Go to other countries, that may not be the case. So if you see a lot of overtime, that could be a flag where in China, it's not too big of a flag for me. It's how do we work with the vendors to not break the law or kind of try to keep it within reason? But you may go to other countries where that's a flag to say people might be forced to be working because you don't usually see that. So it's kind of expanding and understanding, what the workforce is like in the different countries, and then what audit results that are asking the same questions, looking at the legal requirements. But what is that? Is there anything that's going to raise a flag that, okay, well, this is a finding, but maybe it's more serious than I may see it in another country?
So maybe an example there would be, to take your overtime example. If I have to take a bus to my factory job and I'm unable to get my bus home, I might not be able to return home that evening if I'm forced to work an additional 2 or 3 hours of overtime.
Yeah. But I mean,
So
I would go
the
further
character
beyond
of
that.
Yeah.
So like again, where like in China, a lot of times workers are at the factory and dorms, right? Yes, there's more and more as they shift out, you're home, so there's less willingness to work overtime. But other countries where the factories may be close to home, where that person can go home and spend time with family, they may not want as much overtime. So it's kind of understanding that and saying, yeah, okay, yeah, if I'm forced to work overtime, obviously, hopefully during the worker interviews, it comes up if they're being forced. But again, if there's excessive overtime in a country that generally doesn't see that because workers want to come home, that would raise a red flag to me. Whereas in China, the workers at the factory, they want to get paid more. They'd for the most part, again, generalizing. But if you see a lot of overtime, it's not usually because they're forced to work, because they want to work as long as they're getting paid for it. So,
well, that's actually a great segue to the next question. QCA updated our audit sharing protocol for 2019. Have either of your companies exercised this facility in the past?
We have not.
Larry?
We not either. To be honest, we do more audits. Our own internal audits are more frequent. So if the audit question comes up, we usually have. It wasn't a QCA audited factory that's been audited. We're using one of our internal audit reports.
I think it's kind of been reversed in the sense that certain suppliers were noted in factories, and perhaps you've assisted on those audits. Would that be fair to say, characterize it that way?
Yeah, that's true. Several of us accredited companies, as we audit factories, find areas. I mean, every audit finds areas for corrective action, and sometimes the factory owner is, let's say, reluctant to implement a corrective action because you're the only customer of his that's asking. But if we know that another accredited company did business with that factory, I would call that other accredited company or company's compliance people and say, hey, we found this issue. We know you wouldn't like to see this either. Would you lend your voice to the factory owner requesting that he make corrections? So if a factory has 2 or 3 or even 4 of their customers saying, hey, why don't you fix this problem? You're more likely to get prompt action. So we have done that, and we have supported other accredited companies when they've come to us and discovered something when they were auditing.
For clarification to our webinar attendees, QCA has performed over 400, almost 500 audits at this point. We are, a number of our accredited members have production, as Larry suggested. They're producing in the same factories as other QCA accredited members. So from that perspective, it would be valuable for them to have access to a copy of the audits performed in that facility. for 2019, we have implemented a change of policy. We have had an audit sharing policy since 2011. It has been rarely exercised. The changes that are implemented for 2019 are that audits can be shared as long as you're providing copies of the purchase orders that are placed into that particular production facility. Anything you guys want to add there?
No, I think it's just good to utilize it if you do see that. I think obviously as part of the accreditation, there's certain audits that we need to do, and as QCA, we don't want to go to the same factory again, but I think it's a good program that if you are going to factories where we are or anybody else is, why not share that information? So you have access to the factories that you're at, plus the ones that you have to audit, because I don't think it's good that we're the first ones there to do an audit, so nobody else can see it. And I think that the change was as long as you can prove that you have purchase orders with that vendor, that audit can be shared with you. So I think it's good for everybody on the webinar to use that. If you get, if you're doing your audits part of the accreditation, and then you find, well, some of the other key suppliers you work with, they're not being approved to do audits because somebody's already done them, make sure that you do get those audits for your records.
Do you think do you think your company will use the updated program in 2019, Andy?
So while there are definitely overlaps, and I've seen products from some QCA members, we rarely see it. We go with a lot of factories that don't have those. Again, that don't have other people in the industry there. So we would definitely use it if it came up, but again, it hasn't come up a lot because we haven't seen a lot of our competitors, and we have a generally smaller supply base, and we kind of give them enough volume where we're a good amount of their business. So but that may change, especially as, again, I think we're all looking to go overseas, and when we have similar products, we're probably going to end up at similar factories.
So your point, 301 may force this situation.
And I think China's moving in the direction that, again, depending on the product type. Electronics, they want; bags, not so much. So, I think, at least for us, and I'm going to assume others as well, is there's been this look of, let me see what else is there, and kind of moving outside of China. I think the tariffs are kind of accelerating that. I don't think even if they don't go into effect, I don't think it's going to stop. I think, because you're going to be worried what happens next in 6 months from now. So I think, spreading out that supply chain is something that's going to continue with or without the tariffs. It's just how fast do you want to do it if there are tariffs on products that you're importing.
How about you, Larry? Do you see PCNA partaking of the updated audit sharing protocol?
I don't know. It's, as Andy said, as we're moving out of China, it's possible. Although, frankly, so far it's virgin territory. Factories that we've been looking at have not been producing for our industry. So it'd be unlikely.
Okay. So where does scorecarding fit in your compliance program, Larry?
That's a huge part of our program. We have a very formal vendor scorecard process that we review twice a year in the spring and then again in the fall, rate all of our vendors, and vendors that score high get more business, vendors that score low start seeing less business and get dropped. The components: compliance, quality, factory scorecard, factory audits, number of rejections or product held for failing, claims, as well as pricing variations, delivery on time, are all part of our scorecard.
Andy?
Yeah, we have a very similar system, and then compared directly on like the compliance, we'd like to see kind of movement as well. So if we've been with the same factory for 5 years, well, are we seeing the same thing over and over again when we're there doing audits? The quality side, the same thing. Are we seeing the same thing over and over again? And what is the vendor willing to do and change? Because that's a big thing is, yeah, you can have a score and that's fine, but if you don't really take actions to improve it, that becomes a concern. That are you really looking to work with us or not over time? And I think that's where we use it the most on the compliance side as well. This factory had this finding last year when we audited them. They have the same finding this year. Maybe they had the same finding a few years ago. Or we see others where, well, there was a lot of issues and they've been correcting them and slowly making improvements. I don't think you'll ever find a perfect score. Actually, if I did see one, I'd be more concerned that what happened. It's a production facility. There's always going to be issues, but it's kind of, are there improvements? Do you see those improvements? And then working with our vendor base to see if they're not making improvements, having that discussion is, we keep seeing the same thing. Why are you not making improvements? Or even if you're getting worse, right? So maybe you're still scoring okay, but we start to see a decline in some of the findings that we didn't see. We start to see, so what's happening, what's changing in their area that's now an issue that wasn't an issue before, and why.
I'd like to kind of shift the discussion now. What has the government shutdown meant for your companies? Anything?
So one of the things that we're looking at is that anything you need registered with the government, right? So that's going to be affected. Some of the electronics, when you got to get FCC stuff like that, it may be delayed or it's slow. So I think the longer it goes on, the more you're going to see, well, stuff is taking longer than it was, or I can't get something done because the government's closed.
Larry, anything on your end?
Well, it's the same. The government agencies are really, CPSC's, most of their staff has been let go. They're doing, I believe they're doing basic inspections at the port, but I suspect that from a manpower perspective, they scaled that back. The FDA is still doing some work, but it's hard to get answers. And if you have something that you've imported that the FDA has a question on, it's going to be hard to get through to somebody at the FDA to address the problem. Customs, people at the ports are working, but overtime they're not working on overtime. So they're trying to get things done in an 8-hour day. And frankly, there's a lot of cargo out there. So 8-hour days, so they're backing up. So I think that's going to continue to be an issue.
I've noticed that FDA, for example, is very difficult to get a response from. And that was always true.
Yeah, even on the best day, they're hard to get hold of.
Yeah. But it's portions of their websites are down, are not being maintained. Same with CPSC.
Yeah.
Many of the government agencies' websites have this warning that effectively says, we're not updating the website, or it's just not being refreshed.
EPA. Yeah. So that kind of pushes the burden, well, it does push the burden of the risk assessment even more so on companies where you might have been able to ask questions to discuss potential issues with the regulators. You're forced to kind of go it alone. So my next question, according to the CDC, the top 5 most common injuries reported from emergency rooms include unintentional falls, being unintentionally struck by something, moving vehicle occupant, overexertion, or unintentional piercing, slicing, or cutting. All of these when you think about the products, whether it's a stadium chair collapsing or something breaking off of a mug, maybe you slam it down on the desk and it explodes. I'm thinking of a clay mug, a ceramic mug. If it's not fired properly, it can break in a way that it's not intended to. All of these things require that we look at our risk assessment. Do you think you're looking any differently at your risk assessment now? Are you looking more closely at it? Or do you think, because the government can't give us answers right now, the federal government can't give us answers right now in the time that we need those answers, do you think you're forced to, what does due care look like for you?
Well, I think that reputable companies have always had processes to look at if the products are manufactured correctly. So with chairs, I think many of us do static load tests just to make sure they'll hold an individual's weight who's sitting in it for whatever. I mean, you'll see chairs with different weight limits on it. And, static load tests are done by the laboratories to establish will it hold that static load. I think many of us do that. Same with mugs. We'll do testing. It's one of those hidden defects you don't see very well, but if you learn that mugs are shattering, we all do tests to figure out what's going on and address the problems. But I think some of these things are really workplace issues that we need to look at in our own work environment. So those of us who do decorating, we have safety committees that run through the plant monthly. Are looking for trip hazards, we monitor for people to get cut on the job, and put in place corrective actions to prevent that. Good to have in the office as well. Just because the production floor is safe, you could have an office with extension cords stretched across aisles between cubicles, things that follow, shelves that aren't attached properly and fall. Everybody needs to be cognizant of the risks around them, take steps to mediate them.
Yeah, and I think, to the question about if the government shutdown is affecting the process, for us, it's not. We have, on the product side, we have a review process as we're designing and developing products that's not going to change because, now maybe the government isn't checking as closely. If there's questions, a lot of that is regulatory compliance. So like we mentioned earlier, a lot of the CDC things that you mentioned, and most recalls are not because you're not meeting a regulation. So, it's to me, it doesn't change our process. It's just making sure that we do that well and continue to do it and look at things. And like Larry mentioned, things around the workplace as well, making sure that you have a safety committee, that you're recording incidents, that you're taking actions if things happen. But I don't think whether the government's open or not that changes anything.
Yeah, and I'd like to make clear, Andy made a good point, that just because the government's closed doesn't impact our product review process, and that most products that are recalled meet the applicable regulatory requirement. There was some other safety defect. But most recalls aren't ordered by the government. They're voluntary, issued by the company that discovered a problem. Government gets involved fairly late and usually slows the whole process down. The fact of the matter is the government doesn't really do that much at this stage.
Good, thank you. The end buyer, this is The last question I have for you guys, the end buyer and even distributors are becoming more sophisticated related to compliance needs and demands. What changes are you anticipating from these parties in 2019?
So I'll go first. I actually don't think there'll be much changes. It's as long as you have, and all of us as QCA have a compliance program, it's maybe a little bit more discussion back and forth with the different teams as they build up a compliance person. If there's somebody that's been given a role in compliance at a distributor that wasn't there before, that doesn't understand, I think it's a little bit more of a discussion and bring them up to speed. I don't anticipate a lot of changes, other than more questions. And I think end buyers the same thing. If they're pulling in their programs into their general compliance kind of field, you're going to see, again, just kind of those requirements that you should be meeting anyway. We have a couple brands that we work with, and it's the same thing. They're looking at it more. So it's more about having a discussion and kind of saying, well, this is what you need. We're probably already doing it. So a lot of times it's just explaining what we're doing, why we're doing it, and making sure it meets whatever that requirement is, whether it's from a distributor that has a requirement or that has, or an end buyer that has a requirement. Again, all of us, because we're in QCA, have a good foundation, good starting point. So I don't think there's much in terms of distributors or end buyers coming in and saying, well, you need to be doing this, and you're going to be like, I can, or I'm not willing to. I mean, a lot of times it's also, what is the request, and am I doing something? Am I comfortable with what I do, and can I explain that to whoever's buying the product? And again, either we can make adjustments for them if needed, or sometimes it's something that we can do, or not moving forward with them because requirements are out there. But that usually doesn't come up. But it's like we will find either a product, if it's product related, or factory, that we can usually find something. But it's just, again, I think more discussions with distributors and end buyers, and kind of clarifying points as there's more requirements for it.
Mm-hmm. Larry, any thoughts there?
Well, I think I agree with Andy that there are today, so QCA got founded, 11 years ago. Today, there are more distributors with compliance departments by far than there were in 2008. Mm-hmm. Back then, very few distributors, very few suppliers had compliance departments. So I think it's great that more are involved and have a look, and I think that'll continue. I think something that may change, last week at the QCA board meeting, the board approved creating a distributor certification program. Mm-hmm. So distributors could become certified by QCA, and the compliance committee will be working on that coming months. And later this year, there may be the opportunity for distributors who'd like to become certified and be able to have QCA really vet their systems so they can go to their customers, show that they have robust systems in place to ensure compliance. I think it's great to have a third party do that. I think that'll become available to distributors later this year.
Great segue.
Yep.
So with that, I'll open it up to any questions from our attendees. Thank you. Thank you both. I wonder if our attendees had any follow-up to some of the responses provided by Larry and Andy, whether you're also experiencing that. It doesn't look like we have anyone who'd like to volunteer additional information at this time. So with that, I'd like to say thank you both. Thanks to both of you for your insights regarding what's possibly going to keep you up in 2019. And I'd also like to thank our attendees for joining us for the Compliance Committee sponsored webinar series. We'll return next month, same time, same channel. So thanks so much.
Thank you,
Have a good
Dee.
day. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.